Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Use of Pleasure, Volume 2 of the History of Sexuality, by Michel Foucault, translated by Robert Hurley, narrated by Elliot Fitzpatrick. Introduction 1. Modifications. This series of studies is being published later than I had anticipated, and in a form that is altogether different. I will explain why. It was intended to be neither a history of sexual behaviors nor a history of representations, but a history of sexuality. The quotation marks have a certain importance. My aim was not to write a history of sexual behaviors and practices, tracing their successive forms, their evolution, and their dissemination. Nor was it to analyze the scientific, religious, or philosophical ideas through which these behaviors have been represented. I wanted first to dwell on that quite recent and banal notion of sexuality, to stand detached from it, bracketing its familiarity, in order to analyze the theoretical and practical context with which it has been associated. The term itself did not appear until the beginning of the 19th century, a fact that should be neither underestimated nor overinterpreted. It does point to something other than a simple recasting of vocabulary, but obviously it does not mark the sudden emergence of that to which sexuality refers. The use of the word was established in connection with other phenomena. The development of diverse fields of knowledge, embracing the biological mechanisms of reproduction, as well as the individual or social variants of behavior, the establishment of a set of rules and norms, in part traditional, in part new, which found support in religious, judicial, pedagogical, and medical institutions, and changes in the way individuals were led to assign meaning and value to their conduct, their duties, their pleasures, their feelings and sensations, their dreams. In short, it was a matter of seeing how an experience came to be constituted in modern Western societies, an experience that caused individuals to recognize themselves as subjects of a sexuality, which was accessible to very diverse fields of knowledge and linked to a system of rules and constraints. What I planned, therefore, was a history of the experience of sexuality, where experience is understood as the correlation between fields of knowledge, types of normativity, and forms of subjectivity in a particular culture. To speak of sexuality in this way, I had to break with a conception that was rather common. Sexuality was conceived of as a constant. The hypothesis was that where it was manifested in historically singular forms, this was through various mechanisms of repression, to which it was bound to be subjected in every society. What this amounted to, in effect, was that desire and the subject of desire were withdrawn from the historical field, and interdiction as a general form was made to account for anything historical in sexuality. But rejection of this hypothesis was not sufficient by itself. To speak of sexuality as a historically singular experience also presupposed the availability of tools capable of analyzing the peculiar characteristics and interrelations of the three axes that constitute it. 1. The formation of sciences, savoir, that refer to it. 2. The systems of power that regulate its practice. 3. The forms within which individuals are obliged to recognize themselves as subjects of this sexuality. Now, as to the first 2 points, the work I had undertaken previously, having to do first with medicine and psychiatry, and then with punitive power and disciplinary practices, provided me with the tools I needed. The analysis of discursive practices made it possible to trace the formation of disciplines, savoir, while escaping the dilemma of science versus ideology. And the analysis of power relations and their technologies made it possible to view them as open strategies, while escaping the alternative of a power conceived of as domination or exposed as a simulacrum. But when I came to study the modes according to which individuals are given to recognize themselves as sexual subjects, the problems were much greater. At the time, the notion of desire, or of the desiring subject, constituted, if not a theory, then at least a generally accepted theoretical theme. This very acceptance was odd. It was this same theme, in fact, or variations thereof, that was found not only at the very center of the traditional theory, but also in the conceptions that sought to detach themselves from it. It was this theme, too, that appeared to have been inherited in the 19th and 20th centuries from a long Christian tradition. While the experience of sexuality as a singular historical figure is perhaps quite distinct from the Christian experience of the flesh, both appear nonetheless to be dominated by the principle of desiring man. In any case, it seemed to me that one could not very well analyze the formation and development of the experience of sexuality from the 18th century onward without doing a historical and critical study dealing with desire and the desiring subject. In other words, without undertaking a genealogy. This does not mean that I proposed to write a history of the successive conceptions of desire, of concupiscence, or of libido, but rather to analyze the practices by which individuals were led to focus their attention on themselves, to decipher, recognize, and acknowledge themselves as subjects of desire, bringing into play between themselves and themselves a certain relationship that allows them to discover, in desire, the truth of their being, be it natural or fallen. In short, with this genealogy, the idea was to investigate how individuals were led to practice, on themselves and on others, a hermeneutics of desire, a hermeneutics of which their sexual behavior was doubtless the occasion, but certainly not the exclusive domain. Thus, in order to understand how the modern individual could experience himself as a subject of sexuality, it was essential first to determine how, for centuries, Western man had been brought to recognize himself as a subject of desire. A theoretical shift had seemed necessary in order to analyze what was often designated as the advancement of learning. It led me to examine the forms of discursive practices that articulated the human sciences. A theoretical shift had also been required in order to analyze what is often described as the manifestations of power. It led me to examine, rather, the manifold relations, the open strategies, and the rational techniques that articulate the exercise of powers. It appeared that I now had to undertake a third shift in order to analyze what is termed the subject. It seemed appropriate to look for the forms and modalities of the relation to self by which the individual constitutes and recognizes himself qua subject. After first studying the games of truth, jeux de vérité, in their interplay with one another, as exemplified by certain empirical sciences in the 17th and 18th centuries, and then studying their interaction with power relations, as exemplified by punitive practices, I felt obliged to study the games of truth in the relationship of self with self, and the forming of oneself as a subject, taking as my domain of reference and field of investigation what might be called the history of desiring man. But it was clear that to undertake this genealogy would carry me far from my original project. I had to choose, either stick to the plan I had set, supplementing it with a brief historical survey of the theme of desire, or reorganize the whole study around the slow formation, in antiquity, of a hermeneutics of the self. I opted for the latter, reasoning that, after all, what I have held to, what I have tried to maintain for many years, is the effort to isolate some of the elements that might be useful for a history of truth. Not a history that would be concerned with what might be true in the fields of learning, but an analysis of the games of truth and error, through which being is historically constituted as experience. That is, as something that can and must be thought. What are the games of truth by which man proposes to think his own nature when he perceives himself to be mad, when he considers himself to be ill, when he conceives of himself as a living, speaking, labouring being, when he judges and punishes himself as a criminal? What were the games of truth by which human beings came to see themselves as desiring individuals? It seemed to me that by framing the question in this way, and by attempting to develop it for a period that was rather far from the horizons with which I was familiar, I would be going more closely into the inquiry that I have long been committed to, even if this approach were to demand a few years of additional work. This long detour carried risks, to be sure, but I was motivated, and I seemed to have discovered a certain theoretical advantage in the research that I envisaged. The risks? First, there was the likelihood of delaying and upsetting the publication schedule that I had projected. I am grateful to those who followed the advances and detours of my work. I'm thinking of my auditors at the Collège de France, and to those who had the patience to wait for its outcome, Pierre Nora in particular. As to those for whom to work hard, to begin and begin again, to attempt and be mistaken, to go back and rework everything from top to bottom, and still find reason to hesitate from one step to the next. As to those, in short, for whom to work in the midst of uncertainty and apprehension is tantamount to failure, all I can say is that clearly we are not from the same planet. There was also the danger that I would be dealing with documents with which I was insufficiently acquainted. Footnote: I am neither a Hellenist nor a Latinist, but it seemed to me that if I gave enough care, patience, modesty, and attention to the task, it would be possible to gain sufficient familiarity with the ancient Greek and Roman texts. That is, a familiarity that would allow me, in keeping with a practice that is doubtless fundamental to Western philosophy, to examine both the difference that keeps us at a remove from a way of thinking in which we recognize the origin of our own, and the proximity that remains in spite of that distance, which we never cease to explore. I would run the risk of adapting them, without fully realizing it, to alien forms of analysis or to modes of inquiry that would scarcely suit them. In dealing with this risk, I have benefited greatly from the works of Peter Brown and those of Pierre Hadot, and I have been helped more than once by the conversations we have had and the views they have expressed. In the effort to familiarize myself with the ancient texts, I also ran the contrary risk of losing the thread of the questions I wanted to raise. Hubert Dreyfus and Paul Rabineau at Berkeley enabled me, through their comments and their rigorous questioning, to undertake a theoretical and methodological reformulation. François Wahl offered me invaluable advice. Paul Vane has given me constant assistance throughout these years. He knows what the true historian's search for truth is about, but he also knows the labyrinth one enters when one sets out to trace the history of the games of truth and error. He is one of those individuals, rare nowadays, who are willing to face the hazard that the history of truth poses for all thought. His influence on what I have written here is pervasive. As for what motivated me, it is quite simple. I would hope that, in the eyes of some people, it might be sufficient in itself. It was curiosity, the only kind of curiosity, in any case, that is worth acting upon with a degree of obstinacy. Not the curiosity that seeks to assimilate what is proper for one to know, but that which enables one to get free of oneself. After all, what would be the value of the passion for knowledge if it resulted only in a certain amount of knowledgeableness, and not, in one way or another, and to the extent possible, in the knower's straying afield of himself? There are times in life when the question of knowing if one can think differently than one thinks and perceive differently than one sees is absolutely necessary if one is to go on looking and reflecting at all. People will say, perhaps, that these games with oneself would better be left backstage, or at best, that they might properly form part of those preliminary exercises that are forgotten once they have served their purpose. But then, what is philosophy today? Philosophical activity, I mean, if it is not the critical work that thought brings to bear on itself. In what does it consist, if not in the endeavour to know how, and to what extent it might be possible to think differently, instead of legitimating what is already known? There is always something ludicrous in philosophical discourse when it tries, from the outside, to dictate to others, to tell them where their truth is and how to find it, or when it works up a case against them in the language of naive positivity. But it is entitled to explore what might be changed in its own thought through the practice of a knowledge that is foreign to it. The essay, which should be understood as the assay or test by which, in the game of truth, one undergoes changes, and not as the simplistic appropriation of others for the purpose of communication, is the living substance of philosophy, at least if we assume that philosophy is still what it was in times past, i.e., an ascesis, an exercise of oneself in the activity of thought. The studies that follow, like the others I have done previously, are studies of history, by reason of the domain they deal with and the references they appeal to. But they are not the work of a historian, which does not mean that they summarize or synthesize work done by others. Considered from the standpoint of their pragmatics, they are the record of a long and tentative exercise that needed to be revised and corrected again and again. It was a philosophical exercise. The object was to learn to what extent the effort to think one's own history can free thought from what it silently thinks, and so enable it to think differently. Was I right to take these risks? That is for others to say. I only know that by shifting, as I did, the theme and chronological frame of reference of my study, I obtained a certain theoretical benefit. I could go on to make two generalizations that enabled me both to widen its scope and to specify its method and its goal more precisely. It seemed that by starting from the modern era and proceeding back through Christianity to antiquity, one would not be able to avoid raising a question that was at the same time very simple and very general. Why is sexual conduct? Why are the activities and pleasures that attach to it an object of moral solicitude? Why this ethical concern, which, at certain times, in certain societies and groups, appears more important than the moral attention that is focused on other, likewise essential, areas of individual or collective life, such as alimentary behaviors or the fulfillment of civic duties? A reply comes to mind immediately, I know. They have been the object of fundamental interdictions, and transgressing the latter is considered a serious offence. But this is to make an answer of the question itself, and further, it shows a failure to recognize that the ethical concern over sexual conduct is not, in its intensity or its forms, always directly tied to the system of interdictions. It is often the case that the moral solicitude is strong, precisely where there is neither obligation nor prohibition. In other words, the interdiction is one thing, the moral problematization is another. It seemed to me, therefore, that the question that ought to guide my inquiry was the following: how, why, and in what forms was sexuality constituted as a moral domain? Why this ethical concern that was so persistent despite its varying forms in intensity? Why this problematization? But after all, this was the proper task of a history of thought, as against a history of behaviors or representations. to define the conditions in which human beings problematize what they are, what they do, and the world in which they live. But in raising this very general question, and in directing it to Greek and Greco-Roman culture, it occurred to me that this problematization was linked to a group of practices that have been of unquestionable importance in our societies. I am referring to what might be called the arts of existence. What I mean by the phrase are those intentional and voluntary actions by which men not only set themselves rules of conduct, but also seek to transform themselves, to change themselves in their singular being, and to make their life into an oeuvre that carries certain aesthetic values and meets certain stylistic criteria. These arts of existence, these techniques of the self, no doubt lost some of their importance and autonomy when they were assimilated into the exercise of priestly power in early Christianity, and later into educative, medical, and psychological types of practices. Still, I thought that the long history of these aesthetics of existence and these technologies of the self remained to be done, or resumed. It has been a long time now since Burckhardt pointed out their significance for the epoch of the Renaissance. But their perpetuation, their history, and their development do not end there. Footnote. It is not quite correct to imply that since Burckhardt, the study of these arts and this aesthetics of existence has been completely neglected. One thinks of Benjamin's study on Baudelaire. There is also an interesting analysis in Stephen Greenblatt's recent book, Renaissance Self-Fashioning, 1980. In any case, it seemed to me that the study of the problematization of sexual behavior in antiquity could be regarded as a chapter, one of the first chapters of that general history of the techniques of the self. There is irony in those efforts one makes to alter one's way of looking at things, to change the boundaries of what one knows, and to venture out a ways from there. Did mine actually result in a different way of thinking? Perhaps at most they made it possible to go back through what I was already thinking, to think it differently, and to see what I had done from a new vantage point and in a clearer light. Sure of having travelled far, one finds that one is looking down on oneself from above. The journey rejuvenates things and ages the relationship with oneself. I seem to have gained a better perspective on the way I worked, gropingly and by means of different or successive fragments, on this project, whose goal is a history of truth. It was a matter of analysing, not behaviours or ideas, nor societies and their ideologies, but the problematizations through which being offers itself to be, necessarily, thought, and the practices on the basis of which these problematizations are formed. The archaeological dimension of the analysis made it possible to examine the forms themselves. Its genealogical dimension enabled me to analyze their formation out of the practices and the modifications undergone by the latter. There was the problematization of madness and illness arising out of social and medical practices and defining a certain pattern of normalization. A problematization of life, language, and labor in discursive practices that conformed to certain epistemic rules, and a problematization of crime and criminal behavior emerging from certain punitive practices conforming to a disciplinary model. And now I would like to show how, in classical antiquity, sexual activity and sexual pleasures were problematized through practices of the self, bringing into play the criteria of an aesthetics of existence. These, then, are the reasons that led me to recenter my entire study on the genealogy of desiring man, from classical antiquity through the first centuries of Christianity. I have followed a simple chronological arrangement. This volume, The Use of Pleasure, is devoted to the manner in which sexual activity was problematized by philosophers and doctors in classical Greek culture of the 4th century BC. Care of the self deals with the same problematization in the Greek and Latin texts of the first 2 centuries of our era. Lastly, the Confessions of the Flesh deals with the formation of the doctrine and ministry concerning the flesh. The documents I will refer to are for the most part prescriptive texts, that is, texts whose main object, whatever their form, speech, dialogue, treatise, collection of precepts, etc., is to suggest rules of conduct. I will appeal to the theoretical texts on the doctrine of pleasures and passions only to look for clarifications. The domain I will be analysing is made up of texts written for the purpose of offering rules, opinions, and advice on how to behave as one should. Practical texts, which are themselves objects of a practice in that they were designed to be read, learned, reflected upon, and tested out, and they were intended to constitute the eventual framework of everyday conduct. These texts thus served as functional devices that would enable individuals to question their own conduct, to watch over and give shape to it, and to shape themselves as ethical subjects. In short, their function was ethopoetic, to transpose a word found in Plutarch. But since this analysis of desiring man is situated at the point where an archaeology of problematizations and a genealogy of practices of the self intersect, I would like to dwell briefly, before getting started, on those 2 notions. That is, to account for the forms of problematization that I chose to examine, to indicate what is to be understood by practices of the self, and to explain how I was led, through certain paradoxes and difficulties, to substitute a history of ethical problematizations based on practices of the self for a history of systems of morality based, hypothetically, on interdictions. 2. Forms of problematization. Suppose for a moment that we accept categories as general as those of paganism, Christianity, morality, and sexual morality. Suppose that we ask on which points the sexual morality of Christianity contrasted most sharply with the sexual morality of ancient paganism. Prohibition of incest, male domination, subjugation of women? These are not the replies that will be given, no doubt. The extent and constancy of those phenomena in their various forms are well known. Other points of differentiation will more likely be submitted. For example, the meaning of the sexual act itself. It will be said that Christianity associated it with evil, sin, the fall, and death, whereas antiquity invested it with positive symbolic values. Or the definition of the legitimate partner. It would appear that, in contrast to what occurred in the Greek and Roman societies, Christianity drew the line at monogamous marriage and laid down the principle of exclusively procreative ends within that conjugal relationship, or the disallowance of relations between individuals of the same sex. It would seem that Christianity strictly excluded such relationships, while Greece exalted them and Rome accepted them, at least between men. To these 3 points of major opposition might be added the high moral and spiritual value that Christianity, unlike pagan morality, accorded to strict abstinence, lifelong chastity, and virginity. In short, regarding all these points that have been considered for such a long time to be so important, the nature of the sexual act, monogamous fidelity, homosexual relations, chastity, it would seem that men of ancient times were rather indifferent, and that none of this claimed much of their attention or constituted very serious problems as far as they were concerned. But this picture is not accurate. Moreover, it would be easy to show that it is not. One would only have to point out the direct borrowing and strict continuities between the first Christian doctrines and the moral philosophy of antiquity. The first great Christian text devoted to sexual practice in married life, Chapter 10 of Book 2 of The Pedagogue by Clement of Alexandria, is supported by...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?